This is the IBJ podcast for the week of April 19th, 2021. I'm Mason King. Welcome back to the podcast, everybody. If you don't mind me asking you to think all the way back to mid-March 2021, which already feels like a year ago, you'll recall that Indiana University's only appearance in the NCAA tournament, held entirely in Indiana, was the use of Assembly Hall for some of the early round games. The few spectators in the building could see the 5 national championship banners in the rafters, including the 3 won between 1976 and 1987 under legendary coach Bob Knight. But IU's team, the Indiana Hoosiers, didn't make the tournament and hadn't earned a spot in March Madness since 2016. The team was perennially mediocre under Coach Archie Miller, and the fan base had evolved from annoyed to simply apathetic. So about a year after being named IU's athletic director in March 2020, Scott Dolson fired Archie Miller and began a coaching search. What he ended up with a month later wasn't just a new guy with a clipboard, but a whole new regime designed to tap the glory years of the Bob Knight program while establishing pieces that could carry the program for at least the next 25 years. He brought in former IU star and NBA coach Mike Woodson, former Butler and Ohio State coach Thad Matta to keep watch, and former IU standout Dane Fife as Woodson's top assistant, seemingly with the opportunity to take over for Woodson maybe within a decade. A lot has been written about the sheer basketball brainpower assembled in Crimson Pinstripes, but IBJ's Anthony Schoettle has a great story in the latest edition of IBJ explaining how this was as much a business decision as a basketball decision, if not more so. IU basketball has found itself in a dangerous position, having alienated big-pocketed donors since Bob Knight's firing in 2000. The IU athletics program desperately needs those donors to boost its budget to a level competitive with that of other Big Ten schools. With these 3 hires, Dolson has cemented the team's identity to the Bob Knight years and the grand tradition of Hoosier hoops in general. Now, Dolson demurs at the notion he had executed some kind of grand plan, but there is no doubt that Dolson came to the athletic director job with a long and successful history as a fundraiser for the department, and thus would have been particularly sensitive to what donors want and how they would view the next coaching hire. For the podcast this week, we're going to take a deep dive into the subject with Anthony. Here's our interview. I am pleased to welcome back to the podcast Anthony Schoettle. Thank you for making time, sir.
Thank you for having me.
I want to ask you something. I'm going to throw caution to the wind here. I'm going to ask a question out of sequence, just because this has really sort of stuck with me since the announcement of Mike Woodson as head coach. So IU announced that Archie Miller had been fired on March 15th. The hiring of Woodson was announced on March 28th. It doesn't sound to me like IU started with a blank slate and an open mind and did an exhaustive search. Is there reason to believe that IU athletic director Scott Dolson already had Woodson in mind and knew how he wanted all of this to play out when Miller was fired?
Yes. So a little background on that is this. I mean, every athletic director has a list, in metaphorically speaking, in their top desk drawer at all times for the ideal or the candidates they would like as replacements for the basketball coach and their football coach. I mean, all the important financial, revenue sports, they will have those lists. So those lists absolutely exist in every desk drawer of every athletic director. Secondly, you have to remember that Scott Dolson was able to raise a little over $10 million from 2 anonymous donors very, very quickly. And so
that's to pay off Miller's buyout clause.
That's correct.
Yeah.
So this is the way that works. Donors don't give away that kind of money without some understanding of the plan and where the money's going to go. I'm not going to spend $5 million of my money or give $5 million of my money away to fire Archie Miller if the replacement is going to be equal to or less than Archie Miller. So I'm going to want some reassurance about that. And in fact, I'm going to want to know what the plan is. So the way you leverage $5 million is from a person is you go to them and say, you lay it out. You say, here's the plan, you confidentiality agreement or whatever, informal or formal. and say, here's the plan. Here's who we got on the hook. Will you help facilitate this plan? So you lay it out for them. Mike Woodson was a little bit of an unorthodox hire. So it wasn't like, going to them and say, I've got this top shelf candidate from another university, whether that's an up and comer like, Porter Moser at Loyola Chicago, or, an existing hotshot like Coach Bennett at Virginia. I think that kind of speaks to the overall focus of my article. While it was an unorthodox hire, I do think it was very appealing. I think Mike Woodson was a very appealing hire in some circles among Indiana University supporters.
So let's back it up a little bit, and let's talk about the position that Dolson was in, newly appointed athletic director, and he's got a problem with his most popular sport. And from what I understand, is really the sport that has driven the most revenue for the athletic program traditionally. The identity of the school, like in the eyes of the nation and the eyes of the alumni, is tied to basketball. And the men's basketball program, certainly in the last year, but over the last several years, just appeared to be stuck in mediocrity, maybe even beginning to spiral. Now, explain to us from Dolan's perspective, if you can, what is wrong with that picture? How big of a crisis is that really?
It's major. The men's basketball program has been the engine that's thrust the athletic department along for decades and decades, really even predating the hire of Bob Knight back in the early 70s. And then all of a sudden, when you fire Bob Knight summarily in 2000, really the basketball program, with just a few up periods, has been an albatross around the entire athletic department's neck at IU. And I've had a number of IU supporters, money-giving alums, tell me that many supporters have left IU in 2000 and never came back. Now, these aren't just fans or people who buy tickets and jerseys. These are, multi-million-dollar giving alumni. And Scott Dolson, you have to remember, he's in a unique situation to understand all of this from a couple of perspectives. And I don't want to get the cart before the horse here, but so let's just start with the perspective that he's been an IU employee for 30 years. He's a smart guy, and he understands the basketball program very well because he was a student manager for 4 years, the head manager his senior year. But more importantly, he has been the chief fundraiser for Indiana University's athletic department for a lot of years, and has been headed up the varsity club where, all those donations come from, or many of those donations come from. So, he understood what's been going on with the basketball program and how it has been hurting or helping, if you want to believe that, the IU athletic department in the last 21 years. So he had a real unique perspective on that coming into this. And I believe all that came to bear in the decisions that he made.
Tell me if I'm wrong. Really, the thesis of your article is that Dolson's problem wasn't just finding a coach that could make or field a team that could win on the court. He faced a business conundrum. It was a business decision as well as a basketball decision, and he needed somebody that could help bring big donors back into the fold because, for 20 years they had felt alienated from the program.
Yeah, I left out an interesting and very important piece of the picture when I was painting that earlier about the basketball coach at IU and what it means to the business. Dolson could have gotten another top shelf guy from another university, or he could have gotten, I had mentioned him once before, Porter Moser of Loyola Chicago. But the connection that Mike Woodson brings is truly unique from a couple of perspectives. And if you think about the way that the IU alumni and the fans and supporters of that program have connected to the coaches since Knight has been fired, rightly or wrongly, the way that they've connected has really had an adverse impact on the athletic department. You start with Mike Davis, and I think you could very potentially talk about an element of racism back at that time with the reaction, but also that was the guy who a lot of people felt like stabbed Bob Knight in the back. And then, from there, you bring in Kelvin Sampson. Now, Kelvin Sampson was believed right from the outset, rightly or wrongly, to be a scoundrel in many IU supporters' eyes. And he did have some run-ins with the NCAA regulators at his previous job at Oklahoma. But he had a great deal of success in his 2 years. And they were very likely going to win the Big Ten and be a number 1 or 2 seed in the tournament had he not gotten derailed in the middle of the 2008 season. So then along comes Tom Crean. Tom Crean brought up the IU basketball program out truly like the Phoenix out of the ashes. Remember, they were a preseason number 1. Remember, they were a number 1 seed. Remember all the success they had and all the great recruits that they got. And the IU alumni base as a whole never liked the guy. How many times have you heard people complaining about his pacing up and down the sideline? How many times have you heard him called Clappy the Clown? It was on and on and on. And to be certain, Tom Crean was a unique character. He was, you might say, a bit of an odd duck. But for the successes that he had, he was never accepted by the fans, by the supporters. Now, along comes Archie Miller. He was a hot shot from Dayton. He had taken them to the Elite Eight. Fred Glass, the former athletic director, loved him to death, and he never succeeded, but he was never embraced. I mean, in fact, you went from a state of strong dislike, you could even say hatred, to complete ambivalence. And really, most psychologists would tell you that, the opposite of love is indifference, right? And that's where we got to in Archie's last season. I mean, it was the height of indifference, which is a bad place to be.
How important are donors to IU's athletic program? How do we quantify just the impact of donors on IU athletics?
Well, the first thing you have to look at is IU's football team just doesn't bring in the revenue and never will. I mean, no matter how successful as Ohio State, Michigan, Penn State, on, because they have huge stadiums and big regional media contracts and all of these things. So IU has to lean on its donations a little bit more. The athletic department budget at IU has tripled in the last little over a decade. So there's a lot of pressure on Dolson to kind of keep the money rolling in. And the basketball program is really what leverages donation. About a quarter, 25% of its $150 million athletic budget is dependent upon donations. Every single scholarship of an IU athlete, whether it's a revenue sport or non-revenue sport, comes through donations. And all the capital projects, by and large, all the capital projects, think about all those capital projects they've had down there. Cook Hall, the football stadium, the weight room, all of that stuff. There's been millions and millions and millions of dollars, donations. And, Dolson has been responsible for that. So the donations part of it is huge, and they have to keep coming in. I mean, they have to keep coming in, and eventually they're going to have to replace Assembly Hall, right? But it's going to have to happen. That's another hundreds of millions of dollar project.
I may already be repeating myself, but I do want to say I was really fascinated with your story because it brought up an element of being a college coach, and specifically IU's coach, that you just don't hear a lot about discussed at length. Not that I'm an expert about what people are saying, but I feel like I did not hear this discussed. That while the number one job is to win games, Big Ten championships, and national titles while running a clean program, that number two job is to act as a conduit to the school's alumni base and essentially act as a magnet for their goodwill and their donations to the school. I think, tell me if I'm wrong, that you can make an argument that Mike Woodson on paper is just as qualified for job number two as he is job number one, if not more so.
Absolutely. The whole plan that Scott Dolson put together, and you will not convince me that the hiring of the pieces that he put into place here in the last month have not been all Scott Dolson. You will never convince me of that. I mean, it's really a stroke of genius because he connected with his supporters and his alumni base on multiple generations in one move. I mean, it's a pretty amazing feat. Now, you hope that translates into winning. I think it probably will. I'm not a basketball expert. I'm a business guy, but I think he's got a good chance at doing that. But in the meantime, he's made this connection that on top of and combined with winning, I think has a chance really to finally, for the first time, thank goodness this is over, heal the wounds, at least as best they can be, of the firing of Bob Knight.
Just very quickly, for folks who may not be really intimately familiar with Mike Woodson, I mean, what is his connection to the Knight era and really the glory years?
Poor old Mike Woodson. He was one of those guys. I mean, he was a great player, a superstar player. I've been told that moneyed alums love the guy. He is as cool as Elvis Presley, from what I understand, everything I've been told. But I kind of, when I look back at Mike Woodson's career, he had a great career. But the poor guy was squeezed in between the 76 and the 81 national championship teams just perfectly. So the guy arrived when they were in a total rebuild after 75, 76. They went undefeated, won the national championship. By the time his senior year was come around, there was a somewhat known fellow out of Chicago who showed up called Isaiah Thomas. Mike Woodson had this tremendous career, where he averaged 18 odd points a game, scored 48 points against Illinois his junior year. Was the fifth leading scorer in all-time IU history. Would have been the leading scorer in all-time IU history if they'd had the three-point line when he played. Mike Woodson is a guy who stayed close with Knight and stayed close with all the alums and is universally loved, probably as much as any, former IU player. I mean, he really brings the least baggage of almost anybody you could bring in here. It's from that standpoint, it's tremendous. But I would be remiss in not mentioning, Mason, that there are some people disappointed. I mean, there are some alums I talked to who feel like the hire was not premier enough. The hire is a step back, kind of almost a nostalgic reach into the past. And not only that, IU has got some real uncertainties going on. Dolson's in his first year. Nobody's quite certain what he's going to do or be like. The IU president is on his way out, and you might think, well, what's that have to do with anything when Michael McRobbie leaves? Well, we don't know what the next president of IU is going to be like or is going to emphasize. So I think that there is a possibility that Dolson was facing a difficult situation. This is not an ideal time to hire a basketball coach when you have all these unknowns out there. So maybe the most premier guys that you could have possibly approached wouldn't have been interested anyway, or as interested as you might think. So I'm sure Mike Woodson looked more and more appealing as Scott Dolson explored all of his options.
The thing about Dolson's background that you've brought up, but you really haven't heard nearly much about, is that after graduation, he became deeply involved with fundraising for the athletic program, was intimately involved with strategic planning for those athletic facilities, the different projects and renovations. So Dolson would have been particularly sensitive to how the next coach would have resonated with alumni. Where does that fall, do you think, on his list of reasons for hiring Mike Woodson?
I think it's high up, top 3.
Mm-hmm.
You got to have a guy who's capable of winning. There are so many factors with Mike Woodson. I mean, we could tick them off, and we have to be, real about it. I mean, I think the fact that, Woodson was a former IU player and a former NBA player, 11 years, 14 points a game. So he wasn't any fish out there. He was a really good NBA player. He coached in the NBA and both at the Atlanta Hawks and the New York Knicks, huge media market in New York, obviously. He understands pressure. He understands egos. He has recruited, not in the NCAA, but in the NBA, and recruiting is recruiting, as they say. And you could argue that Mike Woodson has done more player development than anybody who's been the head coach, well, certainly since 2000. And player development, in this era isn't what it used to be. I mean, a lot of guys are coming in younger and younger, so you need to do that player development. But if you look closely at some of the other maneuvers, I mean, I think, I think that's why really there's a bigger plan in place that really goes beyond Mike Woodson. You can kind of see that.
Well, yeah, let's get into that. So we come to find out after Woodson is hired that really this is just one layer of what looks like a much bigger strategy. Very quickly, we learned that Thad Matta, a former coach for Ohio State, one of the most successful coaches in recent Big Ten history, has signed on as IU's associate athletic director for men's basketball administration. And I think this move was widely understood to be kind of providing a wingman for Woodson, like an advisor and a sounding board for things that are specifically related to college basketball.
Yeah, and again, Thad Matta has great chops, right? He's the winningest basketball coach in Ohio State history. But don't forget, this guy's got Hoosier roots, not IU-centric roots, but let's not forget Thad Matta was the head coach at Butler University. He understands the culture here. From what I understand, he has long wanted to be a part of the IU program. So this isn't just, bringing in some high-level basketball consultant. To me, if you look at it, Scott Dolson's plan is clear. Everybody involved in this has got connection with the program and the culture and an understanding of it. And so not only does Thad Matta bring a wealth of college basketball understanding and experience and knowledge, but he brings in this understanding of IU basketball and understanding of the high school scene here in Indiana, which is very, very important. Thad Matta himself recruited away several Indianapolis area stars to play at Ohio State. By the way, Michigan State has too. I know we're going to get to Dane Fife, but that's part of the puzzle. There have been several Big Ten schools and beyond who have recruited away big time Indianapolis high school basketball players. And I think Dolson really believes that has to stop. So just to kind of point out a couple quick factoids that help kind of put the building blocks into place. First of all, Thad Matta reports to Scott Dolson, not Mike Woodson. But I think they're kind of, I don't want to say conjoined at the hip. That wouldn't be quite right. But they are hand in glove. So Thad Matta kind of has this assistant athletic director position in charge of men's basketball. So he's not a coach, and he can't coach the way that Woodson and his assistants can. That's per NCAA regulations. But what he is kind of, in business parlance, the CEO of the men's basketball program. And he can help with compliance. He can make sure that Woodson doesn't accidentally run afoul of the rules. He can, help with budgeting. He can certainly, have many lunches and dinners with Woodson and give him any sort of tips or advice that Woodson may solicit. It's a hand in glove move. I think you bring in a guy who really understands the college basketball scene as well as anybody, because Mike Woodson doesn't have any college coaching experience.
So the next layer here is Dane Fife. If you believe the theories about how far Dolson is thinking into the future, hiring former IU player Dane Fife really sets the table for the next some 25 years. He's basically the top assistant, and his formal title is associate head coach. And real quick, explain for folks, what is Fife's connection to the Bob Knight program and his potential appeal to the donor base?
Dane Fife, oddly enough, was born in Clarkston, Michigan. I mean, really in the heart of Michigan State territory. He played for his dad, Dan Fife, at Clarkston High School up in Michigan, and, was one of the best players in the state that year. But Bob Knight recruited him away. I mean, like from a young age, from his teenage years, Dane Fife professed he always wanted to play at IU, was recruited down there in the late 90s by technically Mike Davis, who replaced Bob Knight, did some of the recruiting of Dane Fife, but he came to play for Bob Knight, played for Bob Knight for 2 years. Bob Knight was fired in 2000. He finished up his career playing for Mike Davis. And he was actually loyal to Mike Davis in so much as, I think that the program was in tumult, and a number of the players said, Mike Davis, who was the head recruiter at the time when Knight got fired, said, look, to keep some level of continuity here and to kind of keep our college careers from being completely derailed, we'd like Mike Davis to stay as the head coach, which he did. And then Dane Fife's senior year, they go down to the national, they win the Big Ten and the regular season, and they go down to the national championship game, all the way to the national championship game where they lost to Maryland, University of Maryland. And so Dane Fife started on that team. He led IU in steals several years and is now the career leading steals person in IU history. And he was the defensive player of the year his senior year as well. So, Dane went off and played for a year in the Continental Basketball Association. And then he took over the job at IUPU Fort Wayne, which is now Purdue at Fort Wayne. And he had a solid career. That's a hard place to win. They just gone Division I, and they set a bunch of records for wins in a season and a number of seasons at there. And then he probably realized at some point, I'm going to need to get some better experience here. So he became an assistant at Michigan State. He's been there for 10 years, the last 3 years as associate head coach at Michigan State. And I'm sure some of the people, in Spartanland were kind of hoping that he would be the heir apparent to Tom Izzo, because Tom Izzo is getting a little long in the tooth as well. So, but Dane Fife had said that he had always wanted to come back to Bloomington. He loved Bloomington. And so if you listen closely, Scott Dolson told me that Dane Fife, he was hired by Mike Woodson. But if you listen closely to the comments, now I would be the last person to call Scott Dolson a liar. I think he's an upstanding individual. But Dane Fife had said in a subsequent interview that he really doesn't know or didn't know Mike Woodson. And so that kind of tells me that, it's a little bit of a reach for me to think that Mike Woodson picked out Dane Fife all on his own. Ask yourself this, you would ask me, is Mike Woodson qualified to be the IU basketball coach? I mean, I think really if you look at the strategy of all of this, the bigger question is Dane Fife right now ready to be the IU basketball team? And I think the answer is unequivocally yes. Like if Dane Fife is not ready to be the IU basketball coach after spending 10 years of grad school under, possibly one of the greatest college basketball coaches of all time in Tom Izzo, then when is he ever going to be ready? And what are a few years under Mike Woodson going to do for Dane Fife? Now, couldn't hurt. I mean, being there in Bloomington and kind of getting the feel for what the sideline is like and how everything operates, it couldn't hurt, although I don't know what else he could learn. He played there for 4 years. So I think that kind of points to this bigger strategy. Now, first of all, Dane Fife did play for a couple years for Mike Davis. He was loyal to Mike Davis. And not only that, he doesn't appeal to alumni of even the 60s and the 70s and the 80s in the way that Mike Woodson does. And so why is that key? Somebody asked me as I was reporting the story, well, why would IU be so interested, in connecting with those 90-era guys? No, those guys are headed, 1 foot in a banana peel, 1 foot in the grave. Well, that's just not true. In the minds of consumer marketing, they're old. But in the minds of donor relations, those dudes are in their prime. Nobody, well, hardly anybody, unless you're Mark Cuban, starts giving away big sums of money until you're in your 60s. And then it kind of progresses, 70s, 80s bequeath, right? So that's who Mike Woodson connects to, guys in their 60s and 70s. So those are big time money. Those are guys who are entering their prime or are in their prime. They're not past their prime. They're past their prime if you're selling Dunkin' Donuts and Nike sneakers, but not if you're trying to get people to give away hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars. Now, who does Dane Fife connect with? So you've got with Woodson, you've got maybe the tail end of the 60s. I'm talking about graduating from IU, 70s and 80s. You've got those guys with Woodson. Well, hecky doodle. If I graduated from IU in 2002, which I didn't, or 2005, I graduated from IU a lot earlier than that, you don't maybe even know who Mike Woodson is. You don't know he was All-American. You don't know he was a big stud player for Broad Ripple High School and all of this. And you know that he was a hard-nosed player and that he was recruited by Knight and he led them to the national championship game. And so those people are in the infancy of the donor relationship, right? I mean, it's not like you just start when they're in their 40s. I mean, you start kind of, you coax these alums along from the minute they graduate, but you know that cultivation period is going to be 20 years until you start getting some coin out of them, right? So the guys that Fife appeals to are now in their 40s. They're probably a decade away from being able to start writing big checks to IU. They might be writing small checks. So, man, you talk about a 1-2 punch. You talk about a trifecta of hires that Dolson has made. It's phenomenal, quite frankly. I mean, it's in a way, it's constructed in a way that no other three guys really could have connected. Even if you bring Alford in, well, that's not that's really not the sweet spot that Woodson and Fife hit. And then you've got Thad Matta as a backdrop of knowledge and understanding and all of this. So, I mean, it's really, to me, it's, he's the wizard. Scott Dolson is the wizard behind the curtain. Nobody sees him. Nobody's thinking about him. If you're just a basketball fan or whatever, you're looking at the big green head, right?
Right.
And that is the wizard.
So in your mind, this is as much a basketball decision strategically as it is a donor relations and business decision.
Yeah, I would say it the other way around. I mean, it's as much of a business and donor relations decision as it is a basketball decision. I mean, absolutely, positively. I mean, and well, you could have gone another tactic, right? I mean, if you could get let's just say you could get Scott Drew. Let's just say you could get Brad Stevens away from the Celtics. Let's just say you could get Coach XYZ who comes in here and just wins like crazy. That'd probably win the fan base over. But you still wouldn't have the kind of connectivity that Woodson and Fife bring together. You still wouldn't. And that kind of winning would have to be sustained over a long period of time. You'd almost have to start building a new tradition. You'd have to start building this post-Bob Knight tradition of winning, which you could do, but it would take a longer time to pay off. Or you do this. It's really, if it works, if these guys are able to win some games, it's genius.
Well, this is great. Hey, again, great story this week. And let's check back. But we got to check back about IU football too, don't we, with Tom Allen?
Yeah.
See what we'll do next year. But we'll definitely check back with the Hoosier basketball team as well. Thank you so much for your time.
Yeah. Thank you, Mason.
My thanks again to Anthony Schoettle. You can read more about the dramatic rebuilding of IU men's basketball in the latest issue of IBJ. And before you get on with the rest of your week, I want to point out a few more strong stories from the print edition. Kurt Christian explains how a series of actions taken by the Republican majority Carmel City Council of late is raising questions about whether members are becoming more skeptical of Mayor Jim Brainerd's vision for the city and subsequent spending. Greg Andrews reveals the two highest paid executives at Strata Education Network departed the powerful education not-for-profit in recent months, perhaps an indication that the Indianapolis-based organization is rethinking aspects of its strategy after 4 years of operation. And Susan Orr has the latest on the $16 billion federal grant program designed to help keep performance venues like concert halls and theaters afloat until the pandemic runs out of steam. Again, you can read these stories in the latest print edition of IBJ or online at IBJ.com. I will say it's quite a bit easier to access all of the latest local news about business and politics and all of IBJ's data on Central Indiana's business community and economy If you're a subscriber, it works out to about $2 per week for actionable information you're not going to find anywhere else. Just go to ibj.com and click on the subscribe button. Thanks again for making time this week for the IBJ podcast, which is edited by Leslie Weidenbenner. I'm Mason King. Hang in there, everybody. We'll be back again next week.